This lesson is Styling with CSS3. In this lesson, you'll learn the difference between transparency and opacity. Specifically, you'll be working with RGBA colors and the opacity property in CSS3. Additionally, you'll take a quick look at the box shadow and text shadow properties and how you could use them to add depth or dimension to your designs. To get started, you'll want to open up this page, 11rgba.html, located in your lesson folder. And here we have 3 boxes and 3 headings within the boxes. You'll be adding transparency and opacity properties in different ways to these 3 boxes in order to understand how it works. So, to get a sense of what this does, let's go ahead and look at our code. And the first thing you want to do is scroll down to your HTML and just make sure you understand the structure here. So here we have 3 divs, each with a different class name: RGBA, opacity, and drop shadow. And in our CSS, we have 3 classes: RGBA, opacity, and drop shadow. At the same time, each of these have a specific style for the heading 1 with that class name. And you'll want to focus your attention on the RGBA heading 1 rule, and more specifically, this declaration here, color RGB 230/35. Now you may already be used to using RGB colors in your current styling. However, just as a refresher, the value 200 refers to red, the value 30 refers to green, and the value 35 refers to blue. You've got a maximum value of 255 for all of these and a minimum value of 0. The mix of all 3 values equals the red that we saw in the heading. Now you'll want to add this value, RGBA, and we'll add a 4th value, 0.5. So again, this is a CSS3 rule, and we're simply saying we would like the alpha, or the opacity, to be 0.5 or 50%. Let's save our file. Let's go to our browser and reload. And there you have it. Your heading is now semi-transparent, and we can see the background image below. Now it's important to realize that browsers that do not support the RGBA property will simply use the original heading style. So you want to be a little bit careful. You want to make sure that the styles that you create are not completely dependent on transparency, and you'll obviously want to check this in older browsers. Now for many people, there's a confusion between this opacity that we saw in RGBA versus the opacity that we're about to apply. The opacity we're about to apply is to the entire box, the second one here. So a good way to remember what RGBA does is it simply applies to colors. In this next example, we're going to be changing the entire opacity of this box. So let's go down to our code, and within the opacity class, we're going to add this simple property, opacity, with the value 0.5. If we save this and we go to our browser and reload, we can see that the entire box as well as the heading inside are now semi-transparent, or 50% opaque. Now let's look at a third property which is semi-related to the first 2, and this is the box shadow property. This is going to add a drop shadow to the entire box itself. Let's go back to our code, and within the opacity class, we'll add the following: box shadow 15 pixels, 10 pixels. So what are these 2 values? Well, the first value, 15, is the horizontal offset of the shadow to the right, and the second value, 10, is the vertical offset to the bottom. Again, to see how that looks in the browser, we'll save, reload, and there we can see the drop shadow. Now notice that it has a very sharp look to it. You could use this in some cases, but if you wanted to add a little bit of a blur or diffusion, we have a way to do that. Let's go back to our code. We're going to add a 3rd value here, and the 3rd value will be 10 as well. What this value will do, will add a little bit of blur to our shadow, and we can save our file, reload, and there we can see the blur. Now again, it's important to realize that this blur is part of the box, and therefore that blur has a 50% opacity as well. And in order to really understand this, we're going to add that same box shadow property to the 3rd box, so you can see the drop shadow without any opacity whatsoever. We'll go back. Let's just copy that entire box shadow declaration from the opacity class, and let's go ahead and add it to the drop shadow class. save, reload, and there you can see the same drop shadow, now with no opacity applied. So the question might be, can you change the opacity of just this drop shadow without affecting the box at all? And the answer is yes. We can go ahead and add an RGBA property to just the box shadow. So to do this, you'll add the entire value, RGBA, 0, 0, 0, one more comma, and then 0.5. So whenever you see 3 RGB values with 0, 0, 0, that actually means black, and 0.5 is 50% black. Let's go ahead and take a look at that in our browser by reloading, and there you have it. We're able to change just the opacity of the box shadow. Now, one important piece to add here, we need to add vendor-specific prefixes if we want to make sure that these box shadow properties work on older browsers. Luckily, this is relatively easy to do. I'm going to go back to our code. I'm going to copy this entire box shadow declaration. I'm going to create a line, actually 2 lines here right above. First one I'll paste. The second one I'll paste. And then you'll need to add the WebKit vendor prefix and the Mozilla vendor prefix. It would look something like this. So with the WebKit and the Mozilla vendor-specific prefixes, this means that for older versions of both Safari, for example, or Firefox, those would use the box shadow reliably. And the last thing I want to do is just make sure that you don't confuse box shadow with text shadow. So for example, if you copy this box shadow property from the drop shadow class, and you put it onto the heading 1 rule, let's just see what that looks like. So it doesn't look very good. It's trying to put a box around the entire heading. However, we can change that by going into our code and simply saying instead of a box shadow, we'd like to use a text shadow. Let's save that, go back to our browser, and reload. So here we can see the text shadow is entirely different than the box shadow. And of course, we can tweak these settings by reducing the values in our code. So a much smaller text shadow would be appropriate in this case. Let's go ahead and put in 5, 5, and 5. So again, the first value is horizontal offset, the second is vertical, and the third is the blur. Let's go ahead and save it, reload, and there you have it. So of course, these text and box shadows are pretty cool. As always, please use them with a little bit of restraint. They're useful for creating a little bit of dimension on your page, but obviously too much does not look good. So that's it for now. In this lesson, you learned a little bit about the difference between transparency and opacity in CSS3, as well as the box shadow and text shadow properties.